She told the doctors, let her go. She wouldn't want to live like this. But I did. I wanted to live. I remember that sentence as clearly as if it were carved into the inside of my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink, but her voice pierced through the fog like a blade wrapped in silk. Calm, practical, confident. My daughter-in-law, Julia, always had a gift for sounding righteous when she was doing something cruel. They said I wouldn't have known anything, that I was gone already, that my mind was somewhere far away, drifting in the dark, but I heard every word. I heard the sound of my son's shoes on the hospital floor, the way he exhaled through his nose when he was trying not to argue, the wet shuffle of a mop in the hallway, and the steady rhythmic hiss of the ventilator keeping me tethered to the world. I was still here, trapped inside a body that refused to obey me, conscious in a place where my own breath was borrowed from a machine. They said it was a fall. It was a stupid, ordinary fall that could happen to anyone. The rug by the kitchen sink slipped when I turned to reach for the kettle. I remember the sound before the pain, a dull crack like a branch snapping under snow, and then the silence that followed. When I woke again, or thought I did, everything was muffled and slow. My body was a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I heard my son, David, speaking softly to someone. She's stable, the doctor said, but there's significant trauma. We'll monitor brain activity. I wanted to tell him I was here, that I could hear, that I wasn't gone, but all that came out was air, not sound. They called it a coma later, but at the time it felt like being buried alive under a mountain of cotton. The light came and went, the voices blurred, the days slid into each other like rain down a window. Only Julia's voice cut through clearly, always cool, always measured, the sound of control pretending to be compassion. She wouldn't want this, she kept saying. She always said she hated hospitals. It was true. I had said that once, years ago, when I watched my own mother fade away under fluorescent lights. But wanting to die is not the same as wanting to be forgotten. Before the fall, I was 81, still cooking my own meals, tending my roses, paying my bills, keeping a little dignity intact. I wasn't a burden, not yet. I drove myself to church on Sundays, even if it took me longer to get out of the car. I baked cookies for the neighbors' children and sent postcards to David's kids, even when they never wrote back. I believed in small decencies. Maybe that's why I didn't see what was coming, the slow erosion of my place in their lives, the way Julia began to speak for me at family gatherings, answering questions before I could open my mouth, introducing me as Mom Delaney instead of Martha. She turned my name into a title, something polite but distant, like a placeholder for someone no longer quite real. When I moved closer to them after my husband died, she smiled and said, "It'll be so good to have you near." What she meant was close enough to manage. I told myself she meant well. I always told myself people meant well. In the hospital, time lost its shape. I floated in and out of fragments, the sharp tang of disinfectant, the hum of machines, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the occasional hand brushing my arm. Sometimes I thought I dreamed it, but then I'd hear Julia again, clear as day, telling the doctor that keeping me alive was cruel. She has no quality of life, she said. She'd hate to be trapped like this. My son didn't answer. Silence from him had always been his way of agreeing without having to say the words. I had once thought silence was kindness. Now I understood it was cowardice. There was talk of directives, of paperwork I supposedly signed. I hadn't. I'd left things unfinished, trusting they would do the right thing. Trust is a lazy word. It hides how helpless it feels to depend on someone else's mercy. I remember one evening when the sun bled orange through the blinds and a nurse turned on the TV for background noise. A cooking show, cheerful voices slicing through the room, the smell of antiseptic mingled with the image of melted butter on the screen. And I thought of my kitchen, yellow curtains, the chipped mug with violets painted on it, the tiny radio that only caught one station. I thought of the last meal I made for myself, a bowl of lentil soup, nothing fancy, just warm. That memory anchored me. I repeated it in my mind like a prayer. Onions, garlic, thyme, water, salt. It reminded me that I had been alive in the world, doing ordinary things, touching real objects that weren't metal or plastic. I clung to it while voices around me decided whether I should keep breathing. Julia's visits were efficient. She came in the mornings, heels clicking, perfume sharp, always carrying her phone like a weapon. She'd ask the doctor questions in that tone that leaves no room for answers. Is there any change? Any chance of recovery? When he hesitated, she filled the silence with her own conclusion. Then it's time to let her rest. Rest, what a word. She said it the way people talk about closing an account or ending a subscription. My life reduced to a paperwork decision. I wanted to scream, to grab her by the wrist, to ask if she remembered the sweater I knitted for her when she married my son, the one she never wore. I wanted to tell her that I still had dreams, that I still remembered the sound of laughter, that I wasn't done yet, but my body stayed still. My tongue might as well have been stone. I don't know how many days passed before I realized that I was fighting not just for breath, but for ownership of my own existence. I had been erased before dying. In their minds, I was already gone, a problem wrapped in tubes. The cruelty wasn't loud, it was administrative. Signatures, nods, polite words like transition, closure, dignity. Every kindness was a form of disposal. Even my son, the boy I once held through fevers and heartbreaks, sat by my bed reading text messages while the machine breathed for me. Once, I felt his hand brush mine. He said quietly, "Mom, it's okay. You can let go." I wanted to slap him. Let go of what? Of him? Of the world? Of the part of me that still wanted to taste coffee, to feel the morning sun? I had never been good at letting go. That's probably why I survived. There was one night, I think it was night, when everything in the room felt heavier. The lights dimmed, the hum of machines softened, and I sensed decision moving through the air like a storm. Julia's voice again, lower now, coaxing. She wouldn't want this dragged out. The doctor murmured something about protocols, about waiting for clearer indicators. She sighed dramatically, the way she did when the waiter forgot her dressing on the side. You're prolonging her pain. Pain. As if absence were agony. No one thought to ask if maybe being erased hurt more than dying. They spoke as though I were a failed project, something that needed closure for their own peace of mind. And in that sterile quiet, I promised myself, if I ever came back, I would not be quiet again. Sometimes I think what kept me alive wasn't faith or medicine, but fury. A deep, cold fury that settled somewhere beneath my ribs, slow-burning and patient. I thought of every time Julia corrected me in front of guests, every time she called me Mom in that condescending sing-song, every time she said, "We'll take care of you," like she was offering shelter to a stray cat. I thought of my son shrinking beside her, smaller each year, until I barely recognized the boy who once cried when he broke a neighbor's window. I thought of all the women like me, tucked away in quiet rooms, spoken for instead of listened to, declared finished by those who never understood what we still carried inside. That anger was oxygen. It kept my mind from slipping into the dark. I must have drifted again, because when I next heard voices, they were softer, younger. A nurse I didn't recognize was humming to herself while checking the monitors. She said my name, not the patient, not her, but Mrs. Delaney. She said it as if she expected me to answer. I couldn't, but something in me stirred. That was the first moment I felt the faint pulse of possibility, a small thread of life tugging back. I wasn't sure if I could return, but I knew then that I wanted to. I wanted to feel the weight of my own body, to taste water, to stand in the sun, to tell Julia that I heard every word she said, and that mercy in her mouth was just another form of control. They thought I was gone, but I was listening, and I was waiting. The morning they decided I should die was clear and bright, the kind of day that would have once made me open the windows and let the air move through the house. I remember it because I could smell rain in the distance, a promise of change that didn't belong to me. They said I had been unresponsive for weeks, that the doctors saw no meaningful neurological improvement. Meaningful. I wondered what they meant by that word, what measure of meaning they used to decide whether a life was worth maintaining. The neurologist, a tall man with tired eyes, explained the options in that gentle monotone they must learn in medical school, the voice that avoids moral weight. He said my son and his wife should consider end-of-life planning. I heard the pause before he said it, the small hesitation that meant he was trying to sound humane while pushing the paperwork closer. Julia's voice, steady and clean as glass, filled the room before David could speak. "We understand," she said. She was clear about not wanting to be a burden. I never said that. I had once said that I didn't want to live without purpose, but purpose is not the same as convenience, and they twisted those words until they fit the shape of their comfort. David didn't argue. He never did when she spoke that way. He sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and muttered something about needing time. I waited for him to say what he used to say when he was a boy. "She's my mom. I'll take care of her." But those words never came. Instead, he asked the doctor how soon a decision needed to be made. Julia, of course, already knew. She had a folder with her, a thick one. I could hear the rustle of papers, the click of a pen, the measured rhythm of someone performing certainty. "We can handle the documents," she said. It's what she would have wanted. Every time she said she, it felt like being erased again. Not Martha, not Mom, not even a person, just a pronoun to tidy up. That was the beginning of the end, at least the one they planned for me. I don't know how she did it. The forged signature, the notarized statement, the fake date, but she did it cleanly, efficiently. She always prided herself on efficiency. She had once told me, in that brittle smile of hers, "Nothing is worse than leaving things unresolved." And so she resolved me. I later learned that she'd found an old living will, template online, filled it out with the details she remembered me mentioning years ago, and added my signature from a check I'd written her. She had saved it, my handwriting, my name, my trust, and turned it into permission. It was not rage that moved her, but orderliness. I wasn't dying fast enough for her schedule, for the neatness of her world. In the days after, I felt the rhythm of visits change. The nurses were quieter, the doctors more distant. The small acts of care, brushing my hair, turning me gently, moisturizing my lips, became perfunctory. One of them whispered, thinking I couldn't hear, "They're transitioning her soon." Transitioning, such a graceful word for killing. My son still came, but his visits grew shorter, filled with awkward silences. He would sit by my bed scrolling through his phone, occasionally sighing, as if staying longer was an act of endurance. Julia remained the project manager of my death, coordinating meetings, signing forms, nodding with solemn grace. I could sense her pride in how well she was handling it all. She called the insurance company, arranged the hospice consultation, discussed organ donation. It was her masterpiece of control. I remember one conversation more clearly than any other. She was standing near the window, speaking to my son in a low voice. "You know she wouldn't want this," she said. "She hated dependency. You remember how she was after your father died, how she refused help? She told me once she never wanted to be kept alive by machines." David's voice was thin, uncertain. "I know, but still, she's my mother." Julia stepped closer, lowered her tone to something tender but firm. "And she's suffering. You have to let her go." That was her weapon, softness disguised as compassion. I wanted to tell him I wasn't suffering, that I was fighting, that inside this frozen shell I was alive and furious and waiting. But he believed her because believing her meant he could keep living without guilt. The hospital's ethics board met that week. I heard the hum of their voices outside my room, the way bureaucratic mercy sounds. Professional, rehearsed, perfectly detached. They spoke of prolonged non-responsiveness, quality of life, family consensus. They didn't say my name. They never do. The next day, a nurse I didn't know adjusted the medication and told me softly, "We're reducing sedation. It's time to make you comfortable." I wanted to laugh. Comfortable? They were preparing me to die, but they wanted me comfortable. I felt the air thin in the room, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for me to vanish neatly. There was one visit that almost broke me. My granddaughter came, Emma, the youngest, the one who used to climb into my lap and ask for stories. She must have been told not to expect anything, because she walked in hesitantly, clutching Julia's hand. Julia let go the moment they reached my bed. "Say goodbye to Grandma," she whispered. Emma looked at me, her small face pale with confusion. "Is she sleeping?" she asked. Julia nodded. "She's resting now, honey. We're letting her rest." The girl leaned closer, and I felt her breath on my cheek. "Good night, Grandma," she said. For a moment, I thought maybe that was the last thing I would ever hear. A child's voice, soft and uncertain, saying goodbye because someone told her to. The next morning, Julia returned alone. Her heels struck the tile like a metronome, steady and decisive. She spoke quietly to the doctor. I caught fragments. No recovery, compassionate withdrawal, her wishes. I felt her hand on my blanket, a gesture meant to look loving if anyone were watching. "It's time," she murmured. I wanted to open my eyes, to grab her wrist, to scream. But all I managed was a flicker somewhere deep in my chest, a single defiant beat of my heart that no one noticed. She left the room humming softly, the way she did when she folded laundry, that small tune of self-satisfaction. In those hours, I began to feel something shift inside me, not physically, but in the space where fear usually lived. It was as if all the layers of politeness, the decades of being agreeable and grateful and accommodating, began to peel away. I thought of all the times I had smiled through disrespect, the quiet humiliations that come dressed as courtesy. I thought of the dinner when Julia told her friends, "Martha's old-fashioned, she doesn't really get technology," and how they laughed politely while I sat there pretending it was fine. I thought of every small surrender that made this one possible. And for the first time in my long, obedient life, I hated my own gentleness. I don't know how long I lay there after that, but something inside me refused to accept their version of mercy. I began to count, not seconds or minutes, but the beeps of the heart monitor. I focused on each one like it was a drumbeat of resistance. As long as that sound existed, I existed. The machine hissed, breathed, repeated. I synchronized my will with it, matching its rhythm, forcing myself to remember the feel of living. Somewhere deep inside, I began to see faces. My mother's, my husband's, the people who had loved me before my life became a series of transactions. I thought of the garden behind our old house, the smell of soil after rain, the sun warming the back of my neck. Those memories weren't escape. They were anchors. Every recollection pulled me closer to the surface of myself. Later that night, the doctor returned with a clipboard. He spoke to a nurse about scheduling the withdrawal of support for the next day. I heard him say, "The family has signed." The nurse hesitated. "Are you sure there's no brain response?" He sighed. "Minimal, nothing meaningful." That word again, meaningful. I wanted to tell him meaning was not something he could measure with wires and charts. Meaning was the memory of laughter, the warmth of a child's hand, the stubborn pulse of a heart that refused to quiet down. But the machines spoke for me, and they were loyal only to electricity. When Julia came back one last time that night, she leaned close and whispered, "You can go now. You've done enough." I felt her fingers brush my wrist, and it felt like someone closing a door. That was the moment I understood I was alone, not in the room, but in the entire world. Everyone had chosen their comfort over my breath. The betrayal wasn't the act of letting me die. It was the certainty that I wouldn't notice. But I did notice. I heard everything, felt everything, remembered everything. That awareness became my final defense. I decided then, if my mind could hold on to even one thread of sound or light, I would use it to climb back. And that's what I did. They thought the decision was made, that by the next morning, my name would be a record in a file, a body to be released, a bed to be cleaned. But I was still there, burning quietly inside my silence, rehearsing the moment when I would open my eyes. They had written my ending, but I had other plans. The night before they planned to end my life, something inside me shifted, not like a miracle or a lightning bolt, but like the slow cracking of ice at the end of winter. It began with sound. I remember the squeak of the nurse's shoes on the linoleum, the soft rattle of the IV pole, the faint hum of a television in another room. Every noise entered me like a heartbeat from the outside world. Proof that life continued somewhere beyond this narrow bed. The ventilator hissed rhythmically beside me, a mechanical tide that filled my lungs and released them again. And I began to count those breaths, not as seconds until death, but as small, borrowed moments of rebellion. I thought of Julia's voice saying that I wouldn't want to live like this, and I realized that she had no idea what wanting meant. Wanting was not graceful. It was feral. It was teeth and grit and refusal. I wanted everything: air, pain, movement, the chance to speak again, the right to be inconvenient. I wanted to outlast her patience. The room had a strange kind of quiet, not peaceful, but watchful, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether I would fade on schedule. The sedation had been reduced the day before, and the fog around my mind had begun to thin. It was terrifying and exhilarating, like waking up underwater. I could feel the weight of my body again, the ache in my spine, the stiffness in my fingers, the dull pressure of the catheter. Every sensation was both proof of life and a kind of torture. I focused on one thing at a time: the cold of the sheets against my skin, the vibration of the oxygen pump, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with something sweet, maybe the lotion they used on my hands. These were the details of survival. I told myself that if I could name the world, it meant I still belonged to it. Somewhere beyond the door, I heard laughter. 2 nurses changing shifts, one of them talking about her boyfriend, the other complaining about cafeteria food. The sound was ordinary, human, alive. I clung to it, imagining the way their faces must look when they smiled, the way their eyes moved, how effortlessly they existed in the same world I was being written out of. It was unbearable and beautiful. Then, suddenly, a softer voice entered the room. New, unfamiliar. "Hi, Mrs. Delaney," she said quietly. "My name's Clara. I'm covering for the night." Her tone was different from the others, less clinical, less detached. She spoke to me as if I might answer. "You've been here a while, huh? I read your chart. You like gardening? My grandma used to have these roses that bloomed even in the heat." I wanted to tell her yes, that I had yellow ones called Peace, and that they smelled faintly of lemon when you cut them at dusk. I wanted to tell her about the soil, about the way the earth feels cool even in July. But all I could do was listen. She hummed as she worked, something low and tender, a tune without words. I think it might have been "What a Wonderful World." Later that night, Clara came back after finishing her rounds. "You probably don't get much company," she said softly. "Hospitals are lonely, huh?" I could feel the warmth of her hand as she adjusted my blanket. "You remind me of my grandma. She passed last year. I used to sit with her and tell her about my day, even when she couldn't talk back. The doctor said she couldn't hear me, but I swear sometimes she squeezed my fingers." She paused, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the pressure of touch that wasn't professional but human. Her fingers lingered, just a moment longer than necessary, and in that pause, I decided to try. I focused every thread of willpower on the smallest thing I could control, my right index finger. It trembled, not much, not enough to be seen easily, but enough that I felt it move. The rush of shock that followed was like electricity. Clara gasped. "Wait," she whispered. "Did you?" She leaned closer. "Do that again if you can." I tried. The muscle obeyed me a little more. The sound that escaped her throat was half laugh, half cry. "Oh my God, you're in there!" I heard her run out of the room, calling for the doctor, her voice breaking with excitement. When she returned with him, her face was flushed, her eyes wide. "She moved," Clara said, "her finger twice." The doctor looked skeptical. "Reflex," he muttered. "It happens." Clara insisted. "No, it was deliberate. I was talking to her, and she responded." He sighed, checked the monitors, shined a light into my eyes, and said in that tired, detached tone, "We'll make a note of it. But these things don't usually mean consciousness." Then he left, already thinking about the next patient, the next task, the next quiet death. Clara stayed. "Don't you worry," she said softly. "I saw it. I know you're still here." Her words were a lifeline thrown into the dark. I clung to them like air. After that night, everything became sharper. The sedatives continued to wear off, and the veil between thought and reality thinned until I could feel the passage of time again. Each hour was an act of endurance. The hospital noises, the rhythmic beeping, the doors swinging, the whispered conversations became coordinates on a map I followed back toward the world. Clara returned each shift, talking to me about her classes, her cat, the way the hospital food never changed. She told me she was saving money to move to a bigger apartment with sunlight and real curtains. Her voice became my anchor, her presence the only sign that I still existed to someone. Sometimes she would lean close and say, "You're getting stronger, Mrs. Delaney. I can feel it." And I believed her. but Julia's shadow stretched even here. I knew from the murmurs and half-heard conversations that she was still pushing the doctors. "Residual reflexes don't mean consciousness," she said once, her voice tight with irritation. "We can't keep dragging this out." The doctor hesitated. There was measurable change in EEG patterns. "Minimal," she snapped. "You said it yourself." My son wasn't there that day. Maybe he couldn't bear it. Maybe he didn't want to contradict her. But I knew he had stopped fighting. I felt it in the way no one said my name anymore when they entered the room. I was a case, a number, and almost. Clara grew quieter after those meetings. I sensed her frustration, the limits of what she could do. One night she whispered, "They want to remove life support tomorrow." My heart thudded violently against my ribs, and I swear the monitor caught it. I tried to tell them to wait, but Julia brought in the paperwork. I don't think the doctor even checked the signature. "I'm sorry." She reached for my hand again, and I fought with everything I had to squeeze hers. For a moment, just barely, my fingers closed around hers. She gasped. "You're trying," she said. Okay, I'm here." I wanted to tell her to get help, to bring someone else, but my throat was a desert. The only sound that came was the faintest moan, more vibration than voice. But it was enough. Her eyes widened, and tears spilled over. "You made a sound," she whispered. "I'm not crazy. You made a sound." She ran again, brought another nurse, then the doctor. They checked the monitors, ran a light across my pupils. "She's responsive," Clara said. "Listen." The doctor frowned, then said, "It could be a neurological spasm." Julia's voice joined them from the doorway, cold and impatient. "She's been like this for weeks. Please don't drag her through false hope." I wanted to shout that hope was the only thing keeping me alive, that her idea of mercy was murder. The room swam in noise, the hiss of machines, the tension of voices, and then, as if some inner fuse burned bright for one final act, I forced my eyelids open. It was only for a second, a flicker, but I saw light, real light, and the blurred outline of faces. Someone gasped. I heard Clara's voice tremble. "She's awake." The next few minutes were chaos. The doctor ordered tests. Nurses rushed in. Alarms beeped, and Julia's voice cut through the confusion like glass. "This is impossible. It's a reflex," she said, but even she sounded less certain now. I wanted to see her face clearly, to watch the control slip from her expression, but everything was still a blur. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and uneven, and Clara's hand holding mine, warm and trembling. "You're okay," she whispered. "Stay with me." I tried. The effort of keeping my eyes open drained me completely, but even as they closed again, I knew the tide had turned. The decision to end my life had been postponed, maybe only by hours, but that delay was everything. In the following days, I drifted between sleep and waking, caught between two worlds. Each time I surfaced, there was more sound, more color, more proof of existence. I learned to track voices, the steady hum of the day nurse, the deeper tone of the night doctor, the hesitant footsteps of my son when he finally returned. When I opened my eyes again for longer, I saw him standing at the foot of the bed, pale and shaken, staring as though he'd seen a ghost. Julia wasn't there. For the first time, I felt the absence of her perfume, her control. My son whispered, "Mom?" The sound of that word broke something open inside me. I couldn't speak yet, but tears slipped down my cheeks, and he stumbled back like the sight of my living body frightened him. The doctors called it spontaneous recovery, a phrase that sounded clinical, detached, as though I had simply decided to obey physics again. but I knew better. It wasn't spontaneous. It was willed. I had clawed my way back through the fog of sedation, through the layers of silence, through their careful plans of disposal. I had refused to vanish. And when Julia finally came back, her face pale but still composed, her eyes widening at the sight of me awake, I saw the truth written there. Not shock, not joy, not relief. It was fear. She realized then that the woman she had already buried was sitting upright, breathing, watching. And though I couldn't yet speak, I smiled, just barely, because even without words, I had told her I heard everything. The first thing I felt when they took the tube out of my throat was not relief, but an ache that spread through my chest like fire. The air scraped against the walls of my lungs, heavy, foreign, as if breathing had become a skill I had forgotten how to perform. I tried to speak, but only a hoarse rasp escaped. The nurse, Clara again, thank God, was there, her eyes bright with exhaustion and something like joy. "Easy," she whispered, pressing a hand to my shoulder. "You're okay. You're back." I wanted to tell her I was never gone, that I had been here the whole time listening to every word, but my tongue felt made of stone. My body trembled as though the act of being alive required more energy than it used to. The doctors called it progress, though I could see in their faces the unease that comes when something defies explanation. Spontaneous recovery, they said again, scribbling notes, ordering more scans, testing reflexes. I wanted to laugh. There was nothing spontaneous about clawing your way out of a grave someone else dug for you. Those first days of awakening were a blur of light and sound, pain and confusion. Every sensation felt like too much, too bright, too loud, too sharp. My muscles screamed from disuse. My hands trembled uncontrollably. The skin around the IV needles burned. Clara stayed with me through her shifts, talking softly, even when I couldn't respond. She told me what day it was, the weather outside, small details of the world I was re-entering. Sometimes she read aloud from a newspaper or told me about her mother's birthday. These ordinary words were like pebbles on a path back to reality, each one guiding me forward. Slowly, I learned to move again. First a finger, then a hand, then the small, careful turn of my head. Each movement was a rebellion against everything Julia had decided for me. Julia didn't visit for almost a week after I woke. My son came once, awkward and pale, standing at the foot of my bed as if I were a stranger he didn't know how to greet. He brought flowers but didn't open them from their paper wrap, just left them on the table beside the bed. He said little beyond, "You look better," and "We were so worried." The words fell flat, thin as dust. I wanted to ask him what part of my being alive worried him, the inconvenience, the guilt, or the way truth was about to catch up to him. When I tried to speak, my voice cracked into a faint croak. He winced at the sound. "Don't strain yourself," he said quickly, and left before I could try again. It took me days to find enough strength to sit up on my own, and even then I felt the world tilt whenever I tried. But I refused to surrender to the bed again. I had been still long enough. When Julia finally appeared, it was a Sunday afternoon. I saw her reflection in the glass before she entered, her hair neatly pinned, her lips pressed into a polite line. She carried a bouquet of lilies, the same kind they had placed on my husband's coffin, and for a moment the air in the room thickened with irony. "Martha," she said softly, "you're awake." Her voice was perfectly measured, as though she were greeting a business acquaintance after a long trip. I stared at her for a long time before answering, forcing the words through my dry throat. "Yes," I whispered. "I heard you." She blinked, her composure cracking for just a second. "Heard what?" she asked. I took a shallow breath, the effort enormous. Everything. The silence that followed stretched like wire between us. Her hands tightened on the bouquet until one of the stems snapped. She set the flowers down beside the bed without meeting my eyes. You must be confused, she said quickly. The medications, they can cause memory distortion. You were unconscious for a long time. I wanted to laugh, but my voice failed me. She leaned closer, her tone soft but urgent. Let's not dwell on what you think you heard, okay? You're alive. That's what matters. Her words were the same kind of poison as before, sweet, polite, designed to convince me that my own awareness was madness. After she left, Clara came in to change my sheets. She must have seen the look on my face because she said quietly, "Don't let her gaslight you. I've seen families do it before. They make you doubt what you know." I met her eyes, the only steady thing in the room. "I know what I heard," I whispered. "She wanted me gone." Clara nodded. "Then don't forget it." That night, when the ward was quiet and only the machines hummed, I lay awake thinking about the word forget. I had spent my whole life forgetting small indignities, smoothing over sharp edges, convincing myself that peace was better than truth. I realized that this habit of gentle forgetting had been my slow undoing. Now I could remember everything, and that was its own form of power. Rehabilitation was grueling. Every movement hurt. Every attempt to stand felt like dragging myself through mud. The therapist treated me with a kind of cautious admiration, the way one might handle a fragile relic. They called me a miracle. I wanted to tell them miracles are for people who have someone praying for them. I was here because I refused to be convenient to other people's grief. Each morning, I stared at the mirror in the therapy room, at the pale, lined face looking back. My hair had thinned, my eyes were sunken, my skin hung loose around my jaw, but beneath that ruin, there was a spark I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't youth returning. It was defiance. I learned to walk again, step by shaky step, clutching the parallel bars while the therapist counted under her breath. With each step, I imagined Julia watching and frowning, realizing that her tidy ending was unraveling. As my strength returned, so did my voice. At first, it was broken, uneven, a whisper that cracked like an old radio, but I used it anyway. I talked to Clara, to the therapist, even to myself when the room was empty. I practiced sentences I wanted to say aloud. You forged my signature. You almost killed me. I am not yours to erase. The words tasted strange at first, heavy and raw, but each repetition made them easier. There was power in hearing my own sound again. It reminded me that silence, though polite, was not survival. The doctors began discussing discharge plans, assuming that once I could walk and feed myself, I would go back to my family. I told them no. I need somewhere quiet, I said, somewhere on my own. They exchanged worried glances, as though solitude were a symptom of insanity. But I insisted. Clara helped me arrange a short stay in a rehabilitation apartment near the hospital. It wasn't much, a single room with a kitchenette, a small balcony, and a view of the parking lot, but it was mine. The first morning there, I made coffee. My hands shook so badly I spilled half of it, but the smell was enough to make me cry. I hadn't realized how deeply I had missed the ordinary. Freedom didn't look like joy. It looked like spilled coffee, trembling fingers, the sound of my own breath without a machine timing it. A few days later, Julia visited again. She arrived without warning, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a metronome of control. She brought a basket of fruit, smiled in that brittle way that meant she had rehearsed it. "You're looking so well," she said. We were all so worried. I let her talk, watching the way her eyes darted around the room, assessing the space, the lack of luxury, the plainness of my new life. "You shouldn't be here," I said finally, my voice low but steady. She blinked. "Excuse me?" I repeated it louder this time. "You shouldn't be here. You lost that right." The words surprised even me, how firm they sounded. Her face paled slightly, though she kept smiling. "I understand you're upset," she said, "but you have to see it from our side. We thought you were suffering." "You didn't think," I whispered. "You decided." Her mouth opened, then closed. She set the basket down too quickly, fruit rolling across the table. "Maybe we should talk later," she said, already backing toward the door. "I think you need rest." I looked at her for a long time, then said the one thing I knew would stay with her. I rested long enough. After she left, I sat by the window until the light faded. The world outside looked ordinary, cars moving, people hurrying, leaves shifting in the wind. But for me, it felt new. Everything I saw was a reminder of what I'd almost lost. I thought of the months I'd spent in silence, the sound of her voice deciding my fate, and I made myself a promise. I would never again let someone else speak over my existence. If survival had demanded patience, living would now demand truth. I knew there would be consequences, that Julia and my son would try to rewrite what happened, to turn my awakening into a misunderstanding, but I had something they didn't. Memory sharp as glass. I could still hear every word, every pause, every sigh. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what my truth might cost. In the quiet that followed, I picked up the small mirror from the nightstand and looked at myself again. I saw a woman who had been dismissed, silenced, nearly erased, and who had returned anyway. My voice was rough, my body frail, my heart slower, but my will was alive. I whispered into the mirror, testing the sound. "You tried to end me." The reflection didn't flinch. I smiled faintly, the way someone does when they realize they have survived not by luck, but by sheer refusal. And then, softly but clearly, I added, "But I'm not finished." It began quietly, as most storms do, with a shift in the air so subtle I almost missed it. The first sign came through the news, a small article in the local paper about hospital protocols, about patient rights and end-of-life decisions. Clara brought it to me during one of her visits, her eyes flicking nervously over the words. "They're investigating the hospital," she said softly. "A review board came after a nurse filed a complaint about forged documentation. They're reopening some of the recent cases." She didn't say my name, but we both knew what she meant. My hands trembled as I held the thin paper. The black letters swam in front of my eyes, but I could read the story behind them, the life support withdrawal that almost became my quiet burial. I looked up at Clara and saw the weight of risk in her face. "Did you?" I asked, the words barely leaving my throat. She nodded, just once. "I had to," she whispered. "What they did was wrong." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Gratitude and fear tangled inside me, choking each other. She had lit a fuse that neither of us could control now. The hospital administration moved quickly, trying to contain what had started. They questioned staff, examined files, reviewed signatures. The forged directive was at the center of it all, a document Julia had insisted was mine. I knew what they would find, the imitation of my handwriting, perfect enough for those who wanted to believe, but not for me. I had lived with that hand for 80 years. I would know its slant anywhere. When the investigators finally called to ask if I could provide a statement, my voice was still weak, But I said yes. I was ready. For months I had been silent while others spoke over me. Now I had words, and I intended to use them. The day they took my testimony, the world outside was wet with spring rain. 2 officials came to the rehabilitation center, polite but cautious, their questions wrapped in professional neutrality. They asked about my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law, about what I remembered from the days before the accident, about whether I had ever discussed life support or living wills. I told them everything: the fall, the coma, the voices, the signatures, the decision made while I could still hear. I described Julia's tone, the confidence of someone certain she was right. And the moment I realized my life was being negotiated like an unwanted inheritance. One of the officials, a woman with a small scar near her eyebrow, took notes silently. The other asked if I was sure about what I heard. I was more awake than anyone in that room, I said. They just didn't want to know. After they left, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the rain drip down the glass. I felt no triumph, no relief, just exhaustion. Speaking the truth aloud had cost me more energy than I expected, but under the fatigue, a slow current of something steadier began to move, something like purpose. For the first time since the fall, I felt that what had happened to me might matter beyond the narrow walls of my own suffering. My story, my survival, could become a record of everything they tried to erase. It was about a week later when Julia appeared again. She hadn't visited since the investigation began, and when I saw her standing in the doorway, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who used to move with such certainty now looked drawn and restless. Her clothes were impeccable as always, but her eyes gave her away. "You've been talking," she said quietly. I didn't answer. "They came to see me," she went on. "They asked questions about your directive, about the forms. I told them what you told me years ago. You didn't want to live like that." I watched her carefully, noting how her hands shook when she adjusted the strap of her purse. "You forged it," I said simply. The words dropped between us like stones into deep water. "You took my name and turned it into permission." Her face hardened, but her voice stayed low, almost pleading. "You don't understand. I was trying to spare you. You were suffering." I shook my head. "You were sparing yourself from inconvenience, from waiting, from watching something you couldn't control." For the first time, I saw her composure crack entirely. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're confused, Martha. You were unconscious for weeks. You can't possibly remember what was said." I met her gaze steadily. "I remember every word. I remember your voice. You said, 'Let her go. She wouldn't want to live like this.' And I did. I wanted to live." She turned away sharply, pacing the small room, her heels clicking against the floor. "You don't know what it was like," she said. "The doctors told us there was no hope. David couldn't make a decision. Someone had to. So you made it," I said. "For him, for me, for everyone but yourself." She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes glassy but dry. "You're making it sound monstrous," she said. "But it wasn't. It was mercy." "Mercy doesn't require forgery," I said quietly. "Mercy listens. You didn't listen." She stared at me for a long time, then laughed once, bitterly. "You're not the only one who suffered." Then she left, the door closing behind her with the soft finality of something ending. The next morning, my son came. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders stooped, his hair thinning at the temples. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, as if waiting for permission to enter. "Mom," he said finally, "Julia told me about your conversation. Maybe you should..." "Stop," I interrupted. My voice was steady now, stronger than before. "Don't defend her." He exhaled slowly, his eyes filled with that tired guilt I had come to know too well. "She thought she was doing the right thing," he murmured. "You have to understand, it was hard for us seeing you like that. You didn't move, didn't speak." "And that made it easier to decide I was gone?" I asked. He winced. "That's not fair." "Neither is killing your mother with a pen," I said. He looked away, his throat tightening. "I didn't know she forged anything," he said. I believed her. "Because it was easier than believing she might be wrong," I said. The silence between us grew heavy, filled with years of things we'd never said. Finally, he whispered, "What do you want from me?" The question startled me. For a moment, I didn't know. Forgiveness? Justice? An apology? None of those seemed enough. "I want you to remember that I was alive," I said. "Not a patient, not a problem. Me." He nodded slowly, then left without touching me. I watched him go, realizing how small he looked now, how much of his strength had always been borrowed from the women around him. The investigation deepened. The forged document, once accepted without question, was now evidence. The police came, polite and grim, asking for statements, for copies of the directive, for any correspondence between Julia and the doctors. I gave them everything I could. They took my testimony again, this time recorded, my voice still trembling but clear. They asked whether I wished to press charges. I hesitated only a moment. "Yes," I said. "She tried to end my life." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to contact your family," he said. "They may not take this easily." I smiled faintly. "They already took everything else easily. This they can handle." News traveled faster than I expected. Within days, whispers turned into headlines. Elderly woman survives attempted euthanasia by family member. Forgery leads to criminal investigation. My name wasn't printed, but people recognized the story. Neighbors sent letters, some kind, some curious, some cruel. The church ladies left flowers at my door, the kind of pity offerings that wilt too quickly. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted understanding, and I knew that was harder to come by. Julia was arrested 2 weeks later. They took her quietly, no spectacle, just a car waiting in the driveway and a door closing. My son called that night, his voice breaking. "Mom, please," he said, "don't let them do this to her." "She did it to herself," I answered. He started to cry, and for the first time in years, I didn't comfort him. I let the silence sit between us until he hung up. The months that followed were both long and swift, filled with hearings, lawyers, and endless recounting of events. Each time I told the story, it changed slightly, not the facts, but the texture. The first time, I spoke like a victim, frail and uncertain. By the third, I spoke like a witness. By the fifth, I spoke like a survivor. Each retelling was a reclamation of self. The prosecution built their case around the forged document, the testimony of medical staff, and the timeline Clara had risked her job to preserve. When they played the recording of Julia instructing the doctor to withdraw support, the courtroom went silent. Hearing her voice echo in that room, calm, confident, absolute, sent a chill through me. I watched her face as it played. She didn't flinch. She had convinced herself she was righteous, and maybe that was the worst part of it all. During one recess, she approached me in the corridor, escorted by her lawyer. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she hissed, "making me out to be a monster." I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said finally. I'm reminding everyone that I was human." Her lawyer pulled her back, muttering something about restraint. I watched her walk away, and for the first time, I felt no anger, just an immense sadness for the smallness of her world, a world where control had replaced love. The verdict came on a bright morning in early summer. The courtroom smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant. The judge's voice was steady as he read the sentence: guilty of attempted homicide by medical manipulation. 5 years. My son wasn't there. He couldn't bear it. Julia stood straight, her chin lifted, her eyes hollow. When they led her away, she didn't look at me. I thought I might feel victory, but what I felt was quieter, heavier. Justice, it turned out, wasn't joy. It was acknowledgement. It was the world saying, "Yes, we see you. You were wronged. You existed." After the trial, I returned to my small apartment. The reporters lost interest. The flowers stopped arriving. Life, ordinary and unremarkable, resumed its slow rhythm. I watered my plants, brewed my coffee, went to physical therapy. Sometimes Clara visited, bringing muffins or gossip from the hospital. We didn't talk about the trial much. She knew, as I did, that some wounds don't close. They just become part of the skin. My son came once, months later. He looked thinner, humbled. "She's in prison," he said softly. I nodded. "You must hate me," he added. I looked at him carefully. "No," I said. "I just stopped expecting you to be brave." He cried then quietly, the way men do when they finally understand something too late. At night, I sometimes wake to the sound of the ventilator, though there's none in my room. It's just memory, the ghost of that machine that kept me tethered. I lie there, breathing on my own, and think about the strange symmetry of it all, how the same air that almost abandoned me now fills my lungs freely. I think about Julia, about the faces of the nurses, about Clara's trembling hand the night I moved my finger. I think about survival not as a gift, but as a choice, a stubborn insistence that no one else gets to decide when you are finished. There's a plant on my windowsill, a small one with pale green leaves. I call it Clara. It grows slowly, leaning toward the light. Sometimes, when I water it, I whisper to it softly, "We made it." And every morning, when the sun spills through the glass and touches its leaves, I feel the same quiet, defiant gratitude. Not for the justice, not for the survival, but for the simple fact that I can still draw breath on my own terms. For a woman like me, that is enough. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom air grew still, as though every molecule had stopped to listen. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was sharp, final, almost cruel in its simplicity. It was over, or so they said. I remember staring at the judge's mouth as he read the sentence, hearing the words but feeling them somewhere outside my body, as if the outcome belonged to a story that no longer needed me. Guilty of attempted homicide by medical manipulation. The phrase was sterile, bureaucratic, drained of blood. I had imagined that justice would sound different, that it might bring release or at least a clean breath. Instead, I felt heavy, exhausted by the long architecture of truth. Julia stood across from me, her face pale but composed, her hair perfectly arranged as always. Even now, even after everything, she wouldn't allow the world to see her undone. When she turned her head slightly toward me, our eyes met, and in that brief, unbearable second, I saw what I hadn't expected to find there. Fear, yes, but also something like bewilderment. She truly didn't understand what she had done. She thought she was right to the end. After the hearing, they let her out through a side door. The crowd of journalists shouted questions, cameras clicked, and the noise swelled into a kind of chaos. But through it all, I heard only the shuffle of her shoes on the tile. I thought of the first time I'd met her, decades ago, when she had come to dinner in a red dress, so careful, so polite, laughing at all my husband's jokes. I had wanted to like her. I had tried. For years, I convinced myself that the distance between us was nothing but difference in temperament. I never realized she was studying me, quietly taking inventory of my weaknesses, building a version of me that would fit neatly into her world. A woman fragile enough to manage, silent enough to erase. Seeing her in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing lights, I felt something close to pity, but it was not for what she had lost. It was for what she had never possessed: humility, softness, the capacity to see another person as real. The reporters came to me after, hungry for quotes, for something clean to print beneath their headlines. They wanted me to say I forgave her, or that I didn't, to offer them a tidy emotion they could package and sell. But I said nothing. Forgiveness, like guilt, is a private country. No one else can translate it for you. I let them photograph me leaving the courthouse, my cane in one hand, my other hand on Clara's arm for balance. The flashbulbs blinded me, and for a moment I felt again that dizzy weightlessness of the coma, that feeling of being looked at but unseen. When the doors shut behind us and the noise dimmed, I exhaled a long, trembling breath. Clara squeezed my arm gently. "It's done," she said. "It's not done," I whispered. "It never is." The weeks that followed were quiet, too quiet. The house felt larger than before, hollow in the middle like a shell after the sea has gone. My son didn't call. I imagined him living in the ruins of his marriage, folding guilt into routine, pretending normalcy. Sometimes I pitied him too. He had chosen silence all his life, and now it was all he had left. The court had offered him leniency, no charges on account of ignorance. But I knew that ignorance had been his shield, his comfort. He had built his peace on my disappearance. I often thought of writing him a letter, not to accuse, not to demand, but to remind him that love is not the same as obedience. But every time I picked up a pen, my hand froze. There are truths a mother can't give her son without shattering what little is left between them. I spent most of my days in the small rehabilitation apartment, surrounded by the plain furniture and the low hum of the refrigerator. The hospital had discharged me, the court had finished with me, but my mind still played its own quiet trials every night. I would wake in the dark, hearing the faint mechanical hiss of the ventilator that no longer existed, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. In those moments, I would sit up and force myself to speak aloud, to remind myself that the voice was mine, that the air was mine, that I was not trapped anymore. It took months before I could sleep through a night without hearing that ghost of machinery. One afternoon, Clara came to visit. She had left the hospital and started working at a smaller clinic outside the city. She looked tired but freer, as if the weight of secrecy had finally lifted. We sat by the window, sharing tea, the silence between us comfortable. "You did it?" she said finally. "You got your justice." I shook my head. Justice doesn't bring back the time you lost. It just stops the stealing. She nodded slowly. "Do you ever regret pressing charges?" I thought about that for a long while. "No," I said. "I regret that it had to come to that, but not the truth itself. She needed to be stopped, even if she'll never understand why." Later that week, I received a letter from Julia. It came from the prison, the envelope plain and official. The handwriting was hers, neat and slanted, the same hand that had once forged my death. I stared at it for hours before opening it. Inside, a single page. "Martha, It began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that I believed what I did was mercy. I couldn't stand watching you fade. Maybe I was wrong, but I didn't mean harm. I thought I was helping. I hope you find peace, even if I never do." There was no signature, just her name typed at the bottom by some clerk. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I didn't tear it up or throw it away. There are some words you keep, not because they deserve saving, but because they remind you of the cost of silence. A few days later, I went back to the hospital for a routine checkup. The corridors smelled the same, sterile and metallic, tinged with the faint sweetness of disinfectant. Passing the ward where I had lain for months, I felt my knees weaken. I stopped by the window outside my old room and looked in. The bed was empty, freshly made, waiting for someone else's story to begin. I stood there a long time, remembering the sound of the machines, the cool hands of nurses, the whisper of Julia's voice deciding my ending. A nurse walked by and asked if I was lost. "No," I said quietly. "I just came to say goodbye." She smiled politely, not understanding. How could she? When I left the hospital, the sun was sharp and high, the air thick with the scent of cut grass. I walked slowly to the bus stop, every step deliberate, the cane tapping out a steady rhythm against the pavement. For the first time, I felt the full gravity of my own survival. Not the dramatic version people like to hear, but the quiet, unglamorous truth of continuing to exist when it would have been easier to stop. The doctors called it a miracle, but I knew it was something else. Defiance, pure and old, the kind that lives in the marrow long after the body forgets everything else. That night, back in my apartment, I lit a candle. I don't know why. Maybe for the dead parts of my life, maybe for the pieces of me that would never fully heal. The flame flickered against the wall, small and persistent. I thought of Julia in her cell, of my son sitting alone somewhere, of Clara starting anew. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who always smoothed over conflict, who believed that love meant endurance. I realized that she had died in that hospital bed, and the woman who rose was someone else entirely. Older, harder, not cruel, but unwilling to be erased again. I had learned that mercy without listening is violence, that silence in the face of control is complicity. As the candle burned lower, I took out a piece of paper and began to write, not a letter this time, but something closer to a declaration. I was there, I heard you, I lived. You called it mercy, but it was fear. You called it peace, but it was convenience. I am still here, breathing, remembering, owning every sound and every silence. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it under the candle holder, not to keep, but to let the wax drip over it, sealing the words in their own quiet tomb. When the flame finally went out, the room was filled with the faint scent of smoke and wax. I sat in the dark, feeling the cool air move through the open window. Outside, someone was laughing, the sound drifting up from the street below. It was a simple, ordinary sound, but it pierced me with such sweetness that I began to cry, not for what I had lost, but for the unbearable privilege of being able to weep at all. I cried for the women who never woke up, for the voices that stayed unheard, for the hands that were never strong enough to resist. I cried for Julia, too, because I knew what it was to be afraid of helplessness, to mistake control for compassion. But I didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some wounds aren't meant to close. They're meant to remind you that you survived. When the tears finally stopped, I went to the window and looked out at the street. The city lights flickered, soft and uncertain, and for a moment I thought I saw my reflection in the glass. The same old woman, yes, but with something fierce in her eyes, something almost young. I whispered into the darkness, the same words that had lived in me since the moment I woke in that hospital bed. I wanted to live, I said, and I did. The sound was barely louder than breath, but it was enough. I turned off the light, lay down, and let the night hold me without fear. The world did not end after the trial. It simply quieted. The noise of headlines faded. The letters stopped coming, and the faces that once stared at me with curiosity or pity turned away to find new stories. Time became slower again, measured not in hospital alarms or courtroom schedules, but in the small rituals of living, watering the plant by the window, boiling water for tea, folding the same blanket each morning so it would look freshly laid. I thought peace would feel like triumph, but instead it came as a kind of emptiness, an open field where nothing moved. I was free, yes, but freedom after captivity carries its own silence, a silence so deep it echoes. For the first few weeks, I filled it with noise, the radio, the kettle, the soft shuffle of my slippers on the linoleum. Gradually, I realized that what I was hearing was not quiet at all, but life continuing without permission. The sound of my own breath, uneven but steady, had become its own kind of music. Sometimes I dream of that hospital room again, not as a nightmare, but as a strange, suspended world where everything had been reduced to pulse and air. In those dreams, I am neither alive nor dead, only listening. I hear the machines, the murmurs, the word mercy, whispered like a prayer for efficiency. But then another sound comes, a steadier rhythm that I now recognize as my own will, that stubborn insistence to exist. I wake from those dreams not frightened but aware, grateful even, because they remind me that life is not something granted. It is something held, fiercely, even when everyone else lets go. Clara still visits, though less often now. She has her own life, her own patience, but she always brings something, sometimes muffins, sometimes a new book, once even a small cassette player she found at a thrift store. "You should record your story," she said the last time she came. "People need to hear it in your voice." I laughed at that, a real laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "Who would want to listen to an old woman talk about betrayal?" I asked. She shrugged. "Maybe another woman who's afraid of being forgotten." The words stayed with me long after she left. That night I sat at the table and spoke into the silence as though someone were listening. I didn't record it, but I said everything anyway. How it felt to hear death discussed like housekeeping. How I learned that kindness can be a form of cruelty when it demands your silence. How survival is not grace, but endurance. My voice cracked and wavered, but it was my own, and that was enough. My son visited once in the autumn, after the leaves had begun to turn. He looked thinner, his hair gray around the edges, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. We sat on the balcony, the small one that overlooks the parking lot, and for a long time we said nothing. Finally he spoke. "I went to see her," he said. He didn't need to say Julia's name. "She asked about you." I stirred the tea in my cup, watching the small whirlpool form and vanish. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "That you're alive," he said softly. "That you're doing well." I nodded. "That's true enough." He hesitated. "She's not the same," he said. "Prison changes people." I looked at him then, really looked. "So does survival." He lowered his head. "I never meant for any of this," he said. "I thought we were doing the right thing." I placed my hand over his, the gesture neither forgiveness nor accusation. "We all tell ourselves stories to live with what we've done," I said. "You believed hers because it was easier than believing mine." He didn't argue. When he left, he kissed my forehead the way he used to when he was little. It was clumsy, hesitant, but it was something. After he drove away, I sat outside until the air turned cold, watching the light fade, thinking how strange it is that reconciliation can feel so close to mourning. Winter settled in early that year. I found myself craving the sound of human voices, the hum of life around me, so I began taking slow walks around the neighborhood. The first few times, I had to stop and rest after half a block, but with each day, my legs remembered what they were made for. People began to recognize me, though few were bold enough to speak. The grocer on the corner started setting aside my usual loaf of bread. A little girl in the next building brought me a drawing of a flower. These small gestures, unremarkable to anyone else, stitched me back into the world. One afternoon, the girl asked why I walked with a cane. "Because I fell once," I said. She frowned. "Did it hurt?" "Yes," I said, "but not as much as being forgotten." She didn't understand, of course, but she smiled, and that was enough. Sometimes at night I think of Julia. I imagine her in her cell, sitting by a narrow window, the light on her face the same as it was in that hospital room when she signed my name on a piece of paper. I wonder if she ever feels the weight of that pen, if she ever thinks about the difference between saving someone and silencing them. I no longer feel anger when I think of her, only a deep, sad comprehension. We were two women trapped by the same fear, the fear of losing control. She tried to master it by deciding when life should end. I overcame it by deciding to keep living no matter who tried to stop me. In the end, both of us were forced to face the truth that control is an illusion, that all we can really do is endure the consequences of what we dare to choose. One evening, I found the letter she had sent me, still folded in the drawer where I'd hidden it. I read it again slowly, not searching for remorse or sincerity, just trying to hear her voice without the filter of my anger. She had written that she believed in mercy, that she wanted to end suffering. Perhaps she still believes it. But mercy, I've learned, is only real when it listens to the one who suffers. Anything else is vanity disguised as virtue. I folded the letter again and slipped it into the pages of a book I keep by the bed, a book of poetry I used to read aloud to my husband. I don't know why I chose that one. Maybe because forgiveness, like poetry, isn't meant to be finished. It's something you return to, word by word, until the sound softens. Now the days pass in gentler rhythms. I tend to the small plant on the sill, the one I named Clara. It's taller now, its leaves spreading toward the window as if it knows that light is always worth reaching for. I talk to it sometimes, telling it about the weather, or the birds outside, or the strange, stubborn miracle of waking up every morning with another day waiting. There's a peace in that, not dramatic or cinematic, just quiet, steady presence. I don't pray much anymore, but when I do, it's not for salvation. It's for clarity, for the ability to keep seeing the world as it is and still choose tenderness. When I look back now, I don't think of myself as a victim or even as a survivor. I think of myself as a witness to what fear can do, to what love can twist into, to how close cruelty can sound to compassion when spoken in the right tone. I've learned that the real miracle isn't waking from a coma or seeing justice served. It's learning to inhabit the life that remains afterward, without bitterness, without apology. I've become something quieter than brave, but stronger too, someone who has learned to live without needing to be understood. Sometimes I imagine another woman somewhere, sitting in a room like mine, hearing voices outside her door, deciding what is best for her, and I want to reach through the distance and whisper, "Don't let them name your ending," because that's the secret I've come to understand. Survival is not only breath and pulse, it's the insistence on meaning, the refusal to let others define what your existence is worth. I didn't come back from death to be sainted or pitied. I came back to live, to remind myself that even the quietest life, if it's chosen, is its own form of power. At night before I sleep, I turn off the lamp and sit in the dark for a while, listening. The world outside hums faintly, the distant traffic, a dog barking, someone laughing 2 streets away. I close my eyes and breathe, feeling the air move in and out of me, steady and patient. The room smells faintly of wax and old wood. I think of all the things I've lost and all the things I still have, and I realize they weigh the same. Maybe that's what peace is, not balance, but acceptance. I whisper one last time to no one and to everyone. I wanted to live, and I did. Then I let the darkness take me, not as an ending, but as a place to rest between breaths,